the game we used to play, and this is probably a good lead into catastrophism, but the game we used to play, particularly that last half year when I was there, when I was in sixth grade, is the boys would be out on the, and maybe you played this too, but the boys would get out on the playground and we would, lock arms, and there would be about 10 of us, and there'd be like two teams, and we'd be in a chevron formation, locked arms, and then run at each other as hard as we could. And the objective was to see which one could break the other line. You understand? So, I mean, and that was, nobody at this new school did anything like that during playground or recess. No, not even close. So it was very different. Anyways, chevrons. When you see the word chevron, what does it bring to your mind?
It brings to my mind an oil company as well as a little symbol.
Yeah. And what does the symbol look like?
It looks like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Pull it up. That game that you're talking about, we had a similar one. Except for it would just be one person running at a wall. You'd say...
one person running at a wall. Yeah, that's a little different. That's not quite the same game. Oh, one person just holding their arms out like this? What?
No, one person running at a wall of people, the wall, and you would say...
at a wall of people. Okay, that's
same setup, just not a whole group of people running at the same time. And we'd say,
okay.
Red Rover, send this person over. And then it would be...
Oh, okay. So you're basically saying what you did was like the sissy version.
I guess so. People were getting damaged for sure.
Oh, were they? Okay. Well, that's the main thing. That's what counts. You want people to get damaged.
Yeah.
That's the measure of your commitment.
Exactly. Yeah. That's how you know who's really about it and who's not.
That's exactly it. Okay. What are we looking at?
We're looking at chevron.
Okay. So there's okay. All right. Well, I'm going to pull up something here to show you so that for now on, for the rest of your life, when you hear the word chevron, I'm going to want you to think about this. I want you to take a look at this right here.
Mm-hmm.
You see this kind of green feature? It comes up to a point right here.
I do.
And you see this white stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you see all this white stuff. That's sand. Now let's see. Here's a closer look.
Looks like a big wash came over that.
You're exactly right. It's a big wash. That's exactly what it was. A very big wash. And these are chevrons. You see how they come to this point like this?
Mm-hmm.
Now, quick decipher. You probably almost instinctually can see what happened here. You had this big wash that came in and washed up to whatever elevation this is right here. And it stopped right here. And it's typical with these kinds of deposits, when you ever have a water flow that's slowing down in velocity, if it's carrying sediment load, the coarser, larger sediment gets deposited first, and then as the water continues to slow, the coarseness of the sediment continues to get finer and finer, and then finally at the end of the flow, it'll be sand or even finer in terms of silt. Silt is the next finer stage after sand. And what you're seeing here is coarser stuff forms all of these chevrons here. The sand up here is at the distal. This is where the wave came in. It came up this far, it stopped, and then it reversed and it flowed back out. Now, if it had only been flowing one direction, it would have been much more regular, a current ripple train, where you would have had almost like ripples like you see at the beach,
mm-hmm.
or at a sandbar along a creek. But what happened here is that this was a bi-directional flow. It flowed in, stopped, and then it flowed back out. So as it flowed back out, it basically, you can see, if it had not flowed back out, this would have been like a continuous ripple ridge across here. And there would have been ripples, see? that would have been what we would call semi-parallel or sub-parallel. We say sub-parallel, meaning they're not perfectly parallel, but they're distorted, but they're more or less parallel. Mm-hmm. So that distortion is also going to be a measure of how much turbulence is in the water flow. If it's a continuous smooth flow of water, you'll get nice, even deposition of current ripples. They'll be nice and parallel and so on. What you got here, though, is a bi-directional flow. Flow in, dump the load of sand. As it's slowing down, like, for example, if you went and you dug holes down here in this area, and then you dug holes up here, what you generally see is that the boulders and gravel and stuff that's up here is going to be finer than what's down here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So you come up here, you see the sand, so you know that right up here, it makes sense. The water come up here, stopped, it dumped its sand load, and then it turned and flowed back out. And as it flowed back out, it just, it just pulled. In a sense, you hit nice ripples, got pulled. And that's what creates the chevrons. And here you can see a closer up view. And then that was followed by successive waves, but waves of lesser magnitude, and that's what you got right here.
How big is that chevron that we're looking at, the full
I'll
structure?
give you, you'll see right here. Okay, so this is a view, the chevrons. Okay, now let's, if we can see this right here. Right along here is a ridge, right? Mm-hmm. And let's see if we can find, I might have another image here. Let's see. I've got better image. I've got an updated version of this where you can see very clearly. Basically, these hills, this is 600 feet high. And the deposits are down here on this floor, and they're also up on top. So in other words, the wave came in, and it flowed over the top of this. So the wave had to have been over 600 feet high.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so I'm going to zoom out so you can get a big picture. Get it? The big picture. All right, so you can see right in here where there have been these tremendous waves that have washed ashore. Okay, so now I'm going to zoom in, and you're going to see this ridge right here. Okay, let me see if I can go to 3D view here and zoom around. So what you're seeing here as we come in is that this wave came in and it washed over this ridge, because here you can see the overwash, the deposit. Well, this ridge that we're seeing right here, that is the photograph that we were just looking at. This is the 600 foot. So that ridge is this line of demarcation, this line of elevation change right here. Okay, so now you get what I'm saying. That edge, that 600 foot embankment we were looking at, is this ridge right here. So the water came in from seaward this way. It hit that ridge, but it overtopped the ridge. You see, up onto this plateau. So the water had to be over 600 feet because otherwise it wouldn't have overwashed. You see what I'm saying here?
Yeah. And
you get the picture?
I get the picture.
Yeah.
And how far inland is that ridge?
Well, let's see. Okay, so down here is your scale of miles. It looks like it's about, okay, that's 2.25 miles if you can see the scale bar down here.
Yeah, so it looks...
So that's 2.5. So that's probably 4.5 miles in.
Wow.
Now,
4.5 miles in, maintaining at least a 600-foot wave.
Yeah, but you can see it overwashed, and then this right here, you can see this is the limits. This is how far it got before the momentum of the wave was pretty much expended. And then it would have drained back off. And if you look down here, you can see here the chevrons are much more disorganized than they are further up. Well, that would undoubtedly be because this water up here is draining back off, and during the stages of the draining, you would have had a 600-foot, almost like a 600-foot waterfall right across here. if you can see, if that makes sense. And you even see you've got some recessional stuff going on, which is exactly what you would expect, because like I'm going to show you in a minute, and you're going to learn about, if you don't already know, what a recessional cataract is. Recessional cataract is like major testimony for humongous floods, okay? And you can kind of see this scalloped ridge line here. That is going to be primarily the water draining off the upland. Because remember, look, from this elevation to this elevation, 600 feet difference, roughly. So.
Wow. And show us that ridge again. Pull that ridge up.
The picture?
The picture of it.
Okay. Yeah, here you can see it's very prominent. But at this point, you see, you're not under the tsunami wave anymore. But here, so this water came here, and then it would have flowed back off, and you can see like this incision right here. Before the water flowed off, this would have been like a continuous ramp right here, a continuous embankment. The water is like ate into that embankment as it flowed off and created this cataract, or this alcove right here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to go back to sharing the photograph again. So the wave came in here from somewhat behind. This is looking more or less north, or more or less the direction of the wave moving in. So the picture, the wave would have come in more or less like from, the lower left side of the screen here, and then it was tall enough that it overwashed this hill and flowed onto this upland up here. Then when that water drained off, it would have drained back over. And if you can actually see, look at this smooth profile. That's because the water coming down is like wanting to pull out, and almost like it's wanting to build a delta out of this material here that forms. And these are probably ancient marine deposits here, because at one time this might have been much lower. I don't know the geological history of Madagascar. So I'm not quite sure what this change in elevation is here, other than the fact that in the ancient past, undoubtedly this was probably the nearshore submarine environment right here, and this would have been this would have been the coastline, right? And the coastline is migrated seaward, and now it doesn't. Yeah, so here you can see in this that's where the location of the chevrons. Now, here's the interesting thing about chevrons is chevrons are paleodirectional. In other words, you can look at those chevrons, and they're going to show you where the wave, because the orientation of those chevrons is aligned with the direction of the inflow of the wave. And then the outflow is going to more or less be the reverse of that. It's going to flow in, it's going to flow out. And if you look at those chevrons and imagine that the chevrons just flip and they're V's, they're going to be pointed in the direction from where that wave originated. Because somewhere that wave originated. Now, what would cause that wave? Is it an earthquake? Well, maybe, except one problem there. The problem is simply that the energy released in earthquakes are usually not going to be considered strong enough, because we've seen some. The Indonesian earthquake of, 2004? That was a big earthquake. And it was a big tidal wave. It was, in some places it was over 100 feet high, but it was not 600 feet high. So earthquakes seem to have a limit of the amount of energy they can release that would be available for producing an extremely high wave. A wave like this could very likely be explained by a hypervelocity bolide impact into the ocean. Now, is there any evidence? So here's the thing you want to do. If you would take those chevrons and you would back azimuth them. That's what it's called. You would look at the back azimuth. And that's looking back in the direction from which the wave came. And then you would look along that line and you would try to find a trigger. And that's been done. And let's see if I have it here. We'll come back to it. If you go over to the other side of the Indian Ocean to Australia, And we could do that with Google Earth, and you'll see it. Look at this. This is the coastline of Australia. Let's zoom in a little closer. Look at there. Can you see the overwash deposits right there that show up on Google Earth?
Yeah.
Look at giant sea wave deposits along coast of southwest Australia. Now, here's the thing. These kinds of deposits are showing up all over the world, right? So are they all separate large tsunami waves? Like, for example, these are on opposite sides of the Indian Ocean, Madagascar and Australia. Are these overwash deposits caused by the same trigger as the overwash deposits on Madagascar?
It's possible.
It's possible. Do you think it would be valuable to know that?
Yes.
I think it would. I think very much it would. So now check this out. This came out, made the news, and then was quickly forgotten. But we're here to remind people that that this stuff that has been forgotten needs to be dredged back up again and talked about. At the southern end of Madagascar lie 4 enormous wedge-shaped deposits called chevrons that are composed of material from the ocean floor. Each covers twice the area of Manhattan with sediment as deep as the Chrysler Building is high. On close inspection, the chevron deposits contain deep ocean microfossils that are fused with a medley of metals typically formed by cosmic impacts. And all of them point in the same direction, toward the middle of the Indian Ocean, where a newly discovered crater 18 miles in diameter lies 12,500 feet below the surface. The explanation is obvious to some scientists. A large asteroid or comet, the kind that could kill a quarter of the world's population, smashed into the Indian Ocean 4,800 years ago, producing a tsunami 600 feet high, about 13 times as big as the tsunami that inundated Indonesia nearly 2 years ago. The wave carried the huge deposits of sediment to land. Now, it's been redated, and it looks like it's closer to 7,000 years ago when the impact occurred.
Wow. So an impact leaving an 18-mile crater in diameter, how big would that object be?
Well, what complicates it is that it has to pass through 12,500 feet of ocean water, or whatever the depth of the sea. Now, if it's within the last 7,000 years, the ocean level is not going to vary that much, a few dozen feet at the maximum, right? Mm-hmm. But not hundreds of feet. So a lot of that forward moment, the energy of the forward momentum is going to be dispersed into the water column. So it would probably be, see, there's a formula you can use. Basically, think of this. The crater width will be between 10 and 20 times the width of the diameter of the impactor, of the bolide. So if the bolide is a mile in diameter, you can expect that it's going to make a crater 10 to 20 miles wide. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a bunch of variables in there. You know, the speed of the approaching object, the density, the angle of approach, the density of the target material. Is it landing straight on the ground, or is it landing in the ocean? Or possibly what interests me a whole lot is perhaps in an ice sheet. But so what we got here, but I would guess, what did it say? It was
18 miles in diameter, 12,500 feet below the surface.
18, that's pretty damn big. So you got to figure that's probably an object a kilometer wide anyway, or larger. That means between 3,000 and 5,000 feet in diameter. So, and if you look at...
and they're dating this now close to 7,000 years ago. That's not that long ago.
Well, no, not at all. I mean, totally during the Holocene times, and certainly young enough that an event like this could find its way into
modern history.
Yeah, and find its way into legends and mythology and so on. Mm-hmm. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to Google Maps, and we'll zoom out Or you know what? I may have a map here already. In fact, I think I do. So I don't. So going on with this article, here's the important takeaway, which is a takeaway that's been multiply confirmed over and over again since this was written in 2006. Most astronomers doubt that any large comets or asteroids have crashed into the Earth in the last 10,000 years. But the self-described band of misfits that make up the 2-year-old Holocene Impact Working Group say that astronomers simply have not known how or where to look for evidence of such impacts along the world's shorelines and in the deep ocean. Scientists in the working group say the evidence for such impacts during the last 10,000 years, known as the Holocene epoch, is strong enough to overturn current estimates of how often the Earth suffers a violent impact. Instead of once in 500,000 years to 1 million years, as astronomers now calculate catastrophic impacts could happen every few thousand years. Now, this insight that was already, this paradigm shift that was already well underway in 2006 has only continued. Everything we've learned, everything we've witnessed, everything we've seen since then has only supported the idea that impact events are far more frequent than anybody was estimating a generation ago. But it hasn't factored its way into mainstream thinking. It hasn't factored its way into the thinking of the individuals and the people that are presumably going to be are going to be the leaders. Does Trump know this? I don't know. But you know what? I bet Trump's administration would be far more accessible, far more open to looking at this kind of stuff. And recognizing that this actually may be worthy of policy implementation of some kind, worthy of our attention perhaps as a nation, if not as a species. Now, I think it's also safe to say, though, that the other side of the spectrum, the ones that just left power, would not be open to this, and we're not open to this because a lot of the inertia, the blockage of preventing this kind of information from coming into the mainstream and becoming part of the mainstream topic of discussion is precisely the same people that want to control the narrative about global change. They want to exclude this stuff. So everything that went out with the Biden administration, which is the pro-climate, which is all about the climate crisis narrative, they don't want this discussion. Why? Because it's going to distract from what they're trying to create this climate crisis that we're causing because we're using fossil fuels. It's increasing the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere by a small but measurable amount, and that is what's provoking the so-called climate crisis. There's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars now wrapped up in this agenda, and you don't want anybody like a Graham Hancock coming along and saying, hey, there were ancient catastrophes that perhaps wiped out former civilizations. There might have been civilizations on this planet long ago that have been almost completely lost to memory, but not entirely, because they exist in our myths. They exist in our legends. We can see them in their cyclopean stonework, the handiwork that's been left behind. The people that were occupying these sites, wherever, South America, whether in Egypt, whether it doesn't matter, whether in North America. The question is, over and over again, well, who built these? And the indigenous peoples living there basically don't know. That's almost the universal answer. They don't know. It was whoever was there before them. But here's the thing I'm getting at. You can't have that conversation, or at least you couldn't have that conversation, other than in limited forums. And of course, look what happened when Graham Hancock tried to bring this conversation into the mainstream. He got attacked from 10 sides at once.
Slandered. Nothing to do with what he was talking about.
Nothing to do with what he was talking about. And those people, and we could name them, I won't name their names, we know them, one of them at least had the guts to go on Joe Rogan and debate him, although from what I've heard, look, we don't need to get into that, but I think that it would have been extremely easy to pull the rug out from under Mr. Dibble. Because
I think the internet has since then. It sure seems like people have debunked many of the false claims.
But see, what we're going to do now, Becket, is we're going to bring this these ideas, this information, this evolving insight into the way the world really works, we're going to bring that back into the mainstream conversation. That's why we're doing this, I presume,
exactly
right?
why we're doing this. Yes. And so in that article there, it says how often the Earth suffers a violent impact. So that would lead me to assume that they're only looking at impacts of a certain scale that cause a certain amount of damage. What do you think would qualify a violent versus a non-violent impact?
That is a very, very good question. We will segue into that question after we look at this next slide, just to bring this to a sort of a conclusion here. Notice this is where the 18-mile diameter Berkel craters, I've marked it right here. The wave would have come this way and it would have washed over and wrapped around this side of Madagascar and exactly deposited the chevrons just as we see as it you can see the wave move this way and then it wrapped around and washed over, because right here where the arrow is, that is the region of the chevrons right there. The Australian overwash deposits, you come straight over here, that's where they are right there. Now, have these been precisely dated to correlate them temporally in time? No, they haven't. Does that need to be done? I would say, yeah, it sure does. This would be good information to have. Are the overwash deposits here from the same event as here, or is it two different events? I don't know.
We should probably try to find out.
You're damn right. Now, look what's going to happen as the tsunami wave moves out from here. Picture this ring expanding out. First, it's going to hit Madagascar, and then it's going to come over, and it's actually, you can find, if you go to this coastline of Africa here, you're going to find chevrons and overwash deposits along the coast right down in here. We'll skip that for now, but we could do that. Now, picture this ring, this wave, the tsunami wave is moving to the north. Okay, now what's going to happen to that tsunami wave as it enters the Arabian Sea? See what it's doing? It's like a funnel, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Now it's got all of this momentum behind it. What's going to happen when that wave begins to get concentrated, funneled into the Arabian Sea? Well, as it gets funneled, it's not going to lose mass. It's just going to redistribute that mass. It's not spread out, but when you squeeze it in, it gets deeper, doesn't it? And as it gets up, look what's going to be happening to it as it goes up through the Arabian Sea and then into the Persian Gulf. What do you think is going to happen?
It's squeezed and it grows.
Yes. Now, is there any evidence of gigantic waves overwashing all of that? Interesting question, isn't it?
It is.
But now, now imagine, let's picture this. You've seen videos of some of the tsunamis that were of the last couple of decades. You've
Yes.
seen some of those, right? Okay, so you know what happens. The wave comes in, the run in, you've got the run up, and you've got the run in, right? The steeper the gradient of the coastline, the shorter the run in is going to be, right? All other things being equal. Mm-hmm. But as you get into a very shallow gradient, now the run in can go really far. Like what we saw there in the images of Madagascar there was a 600-foot elevation change, right? Well, a lot of that forward momentum of the wave hits that, right? And it dissipates at that point. Now imagine that wasn't there, but you just had this nice, very almost flat, but gradient, like what you would see the continental shelves, mm-hmm. which are very low gradient. Now your run-in can be dozens of miles, see? It's going to be a function of how steep the coastline is. Now, up here, what's going on there? Well, let's see if I've still got Google Earth open, because, I mean, okay, here's what I want you to think about while I'm getting back to Google Earth, is how high is that wave going to be when it makes landfall up there.
So it's been gaining momentum and growing in size.
Well, it's not gaining momentum. It's what it is. It's definitely growing in size. It's growing in height because the channel is because this V-shaped channel is forcing everything into sort of this convergence. It's like it's going into a flume almost. So what has to happen now? As long as that water keeps coming, and you know there from this impact here, there's going to be multiple waves moving out. This making landfall isn't going to be a singular event. There's going to be a main surge, but that's going to be followed by pulses of waves of diminishing force. That is what we saw in the Madagascar, because then we saw those secondary deposits of sand that were on top of the chevrons, but they didn't cover the whole region of the chevron because that would almost certainly have been one of the secondary waves following in the wake of the first one. So let's see here. Let's go up to the Persian Gulf. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to stop share, and then we'll go to reshare. I'm getting good at this screen. Window, share. All right, so here we are, Persian Gulf right here, Arabian Sea here.
Mm-hmm.
So we can hover over, like, for example, like here you see continental shelves. If I'm hovering over there, I'm looking down here at elevation, that's minus 230 feet. When I come up here, I'm at elevation 546 feet. Okay, now I come out here. I believe this is Yemen right here in this mountainous region. Now, if you had a wave coming up from the south that was 600, 700, maybe 800 feet high, and then it's going to hit landfall here, maybe more than that, see? It could be more because, again, you've got this whole mass of surging water compressed into this V shape, all right? Well, the logical place, if I hover over here, this is like 350 feet above sea level, this area right in here. So now I'm going to zoom in, and what do you see?
We see wash, as you could say.
Right.
It's ripples.
Yes, it is. Now, somebody said, well, those are sand ripples. It's a desert. Well, yes, those are sand ripples. Exactly, they are. But the sand is migrating over substrate ripples that are composed of much coarser material. So if you go back and take another photograph of this, in 10 years, you will see that those ripples have not really migrated. Because the sand is blowing up against a whole structural feature, not just a superficial feature. So does that suggest that the water overwashed this area? Then what would happen is the water sweeps up into here. Now bear in mind, depending on when this happened, you know that during the Ice Age there was no Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
This was occupied territory, all this in here. Now, suppose somebody here knew that there was this event going to happen.
That there would be a great flood.
Yes. Yes, and they knew there was going to be a great... Now, how would they know there was going to be a great flood? Now, that's another interesting question, because what we're looking at here is we're using Occam's razor. Mm-hmm. If there's historicity to these myths, what we're doing is what is the real historical event that we could describe and document that gave rise to the myth, right? Now, you have myths from all over the world talking about the reality of gigantic floods. We now know from studies of paleohydrology that gigantic floods, beyond anything we've seen in recent times, occurred around the end of the last ice age. In the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene, there were these incredibly, unimaginably huge floods, and they occurred in multiple places around the earth. What could cause biblical scale floods? Well, I think that there could be three agencies. One would be a bolide impact into an ocean, causing tsunami waves that could reach 5, 6, 7, 800 feet high when they make landfall. That could be one thing that caused a flood. Then the second thing would be if you had a bolide hit into the ocean, the water, there's in the immediate vicinity of the bolide impact where all of that energy is released, you're going to have billions of tons of water instantly vaporized and lofted into the atmosphere. And that's going to get carried by winds, and it may take weeks for that water to rain out. And whoever's downwind where that vapor plume, that dense vapor plume is being moved, they're going to see ungodly rain for days. That would have made the rain that washed out western North Carolina seem like a sprinkle, a light sprinkle. Imagine that kind of a rain, not for 2 or 3 days, but for 2 or 3 weeks. Okay? So you've got the potential now, once we recognize the reality of impacts and what the consequences of impacts would be, whether into land, whether into the ocean, or third way, into an ice sheet. Now you've got, add not only the vaporization of water and the melting of the ice, you now have the fracturing. You have the mechanical fracturing of the ice, right? Just like imagine that somebody comes with a hammer up to your car and smashes the windshield with the hammer. And you come out and you look at it, and or a rock falls off and hits your windshield. You're going to be able to look at that and you're going to say, okay, there was the point of impact right there, but the consequences radiated out. It's going to be the same with an ice sheet. It's going to fragment. It's going to be a big gap, hole in the ice sheet, right? But you're going to have an enormous amount of melting. At the same time, you have enormous amount of fracturing of the ice sheet, which is going to allow those waves of meltwater, surficial or supraglacial meltwater flows, easy access to the base of the ice sheet. Now, we know that water is denser than ice. What's going to happen as huge volumes of water under pressure is moving down through that ice, gets to the base of the ice. It's going to force its way laterally under the ice, and you're going to get these enormous, highly pressurized subglacial flows. Do we see that anywhere? Well, as a matter of fact, we do. And they're called drumlin swarms. But let's get back, before we move on, let's get back to what's going on here in, Baghdad is right up here. And the Tigris and the Euphrates come together right in here. Okay, so now you've got this giant wave coming in. So what happens then? It makes landfall and it flows north, right? Now, once you get up to here, let's see if we can do this. Let me put in, okay, so there's Mount Ararat. However, the Old Testament doesn't say they survived on Mount Ararat. It says that the ark came to ground in the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat included all of these mountains around here. So, which took their name from the most prominent mountain in the whole complex, whole montane complex. So, is it possible that somebody actually built a boat?
It is.
I don't see why it wouldn't be. Now, as if nothing else, as a precaution. Now, in the post-flood world, in the post-deluge world, we can assume that there's going to be idiosyncrasies that work their way into any stories and legends. What you have to do is you have to go through it, sift through it, and go, okay, what can we take as rigorous representations of reality? What might be something that's accreted to the story later on? Almost certainly, one could conclude that the moral interpretation of these events is something that's added post rather than ante-diluvian, post-diluvian, right? Obviously, to survivors, well, this was God's punishment for whatever that we did that we weren't supposed to do. So I think we have a basis right here for possibly an explanation for Noah's flood, and I would think that this is likely most likely the explanation for the Noahide flood. And it would fit, you know, in the 600th year of 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. Sounds like it could plausibly be referring to a bolide impact into the great deep of the ocean. Mm-hmm. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And in that day Noah and his family entered the ark, which coincidentally is the same day that Osiris entered the ark when he was murdered by the 14 conspirators, put in a chest and set into drift into the Nile River. For whatever coincidence, of course, it's just a coincidence. We don't have to look for any meaning there, okay? That the date of Osiris's entry into the ark is the same as the date for Noah's entry into the ark, which works out to be roughly the 17th of November in our Gregorian calendar. Rather interesting, isn't it?
It is rather interesting.
Which back in the day may have been closer to late October or maybe early November, which puts it right there at Halloween. So some of the other evidence, the kinds of things that one would see, again, that most people don't know about, that.
So what we're seeing is science is starting to confirm, or at least give some merit to these legacy stories, these ancient stories. And
yes and no. Yes, in that you do have scientists, and a growing number of them, who are willing to dispassionately and objectively look at this kind of evidence with an open mind. But then you have this entrenched worldview that's now wrapped up with political agendas and economic agendas and all of that has no use for a complete overhaul of our models of prehistory. And to accept catastrophism as part of that, and its corollary, which is that there may have been, you know, civilizations, what we would call civilizations, that could have been destroyed, which becomes much more plausible in within a catastrophist framework of history. If you assume that, you know, that if you're pretty much looking through the lens of gradualism, incrementalism, uniformitarianism, there's no place in there for catastrophes, certainly not on a global scale. On a local or regional scale, yes. But you're not allowed to go beyond a regional scale, pretty much. That's the unwritten rule, right? And again, I think the reason is because, you know, you've heard that we're in the 6th great mass extinction, right?
Yes.
Which is complete and utter just nonsense. I mean, it's ridiculously silly. Like, I can't even believe that a serious scientist is proposing that. If you do what you need to do, when you say the 6th great mass extinction, and you say we're in that now, well, I think you need to go back and do your homework with respect to the other 5 great mass extinctions, because what's going on now is not comparable to the Permian Triassic or the Cretaceous Tertiary or the terminal Eocene, or the late Devonian, or the Ordovician, the terminal Ordovician. If you look at those and you realize, oh my God, these were, I mean, the Permian Triassic, 90 to 95% of all species on Earth were wiped out, terrestrial and marine, both oceans and on land. And there was a huge number of climatological changes. What do we know from the Cretaceous Tertiary when the dinosaurs went extinct? Well, we know that there was global wildfires, firestorms. We know that there was a cosmic winter, which probably lasted a decade or two from all of the stuff that went in the atmosphere. We know that in the immediate aftermath, there was huge earthquakes. There was volcanism that was undoubtedly amplified. We know that one of the great basalt outpourings on Earth, which formed the Deccan Traps of India, happened right there within the time frame of the Great Impact. Now, it's also evident at this point that it wasn't a single impact. Now, down in your neck of the woods, yeah, the impactor down there, the Chicxulub, yeah, that was probably the main one, but it wasn't the only one. In fact, what it looks like is that there was a cluster of bombardments that occurred around that KT boundary. So the critics that had came along that attacked the impact scenario attacked it on the basis of an oversimplified model, which is that, oh, well, it has to be one single object, one single impact. No, and it doesn't have to be. It can be multiple impacts spread out over a couple of thousand years, or a few centuries, or a few days. There are many variations on this process, right? But it could have been, and certainly was, clustered bombardment, right? So by the time it was all over, yeah, the dinosaurs were gone. And the climate of the planet, we shifted from the Mesozoic, the great middle era of life, to the Cenozoic. So it was a major turnover in the biosphere of the Earth. The biosphere in the aftermath of that impact or series of impacts was very, very different from the biosphere prior. In its own way, but at a lesser degree, was the transition from the Pleistocene into the Holocene. This is a very, very different world now than the world of the Pleistocene. If we go back, 15,000 years ago, we're at the end of the Ice Age, and there's a 1.5 mile thick ice sheet reaching from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from northern United States up to the Arctic Circle, and sea levels are 400 feet lower. And what's in Florida, what's in Georgia where I live right now, was boreal forests. It's the kind of forest you would find up in southern Canada. That's what was growing here during that period of time. And there's this tremendous megafauna, global megafauna. They're gone. They're gone. Sea levels are 400 feet higher. So all of whatever happened was going on the millions of square miles of continental shelf that was exposed from the lowered sea level. Now that's drowned. It's submerged. It's been washed away. A 400-foot rise in sea level over a few thousand years is going to be a very energetic event. And yes, you know what? We find the remains of drowned mammoths and mastodons. Yes, we find submerged forests that were growing out there on what is now the continental shelf. We don't find any evidence of habitation, really. But then we have to ask, well, have we even looked for habitation? And not too much, no. Do we know what 15,000 years ago, if inhabitants of the coastlines, what material were they building with? Wood? Well, if they built wood structures, they might have had pretty elaborate villages. Right. But they're gone. They're gone. There's not. What's going to be left of them? See, this is what the archaeologists have not factored into their thinking yet. They don't have the catastrophist framework that is going to give you the real perspective on our history, right? In our previous history.
What do you think would happen for science and the world if they started looking and started studying and started to take this quote unquote seriously for our history as humans?
Well, we need to then really come to some kind of a deeper understanding of the triggers for catastrophic events. I personally think that the three big ones would be impacts from outside, what we would call exogenic, volcanism, large-scale volcanism, pulses of volcanism, which would be endogenic from within, and then the sun, variations in the amount, cosmic ray bombardment, coronal mass ejections, And I think we're at a stage now where we're beginning to reconsider whether or not the so-called solar constant really is constant, because all the computer modelers who were hired to show that carbon dioxide was a trigger of climate change had no reason to factor in solar variability, because the assumption was, for decades up until the 90s and the deployment of solar observing satellites, the assumption was the solar constant. The variability of the sun's output was so minimal that we could disregard it. Well, that ain't so. That's not so at all. What's clearly, I think, the case is that the sun is way more variable. So now we have that factor as well. Now,
So we got three very, very dangerous things that threaten our existence on Earth. And
pretty much.
essentially, two of them are not taken very seriously in modern science.
I would say all three of them aren't being looked at, although more and more so. It's becoming recognized that, we need to start factoring this into our thinking. Last summer, I think this has already been forgotten. This happened on June 29th, which is interesting because that is the peak of the Torrid meteor shower. Okay, so on June 29th, and we don't have any hard evidence that asteroid MK 2024 is a member of the Torrids. However, what we can say is that it did coincidentally come by the Earth precisely on the day, couple of days that are the peak of the Torrid meteor shower. But so asteroid 2024 MK was discovered on June 16th. Okay, then on June 29th, less than 2 weeks, it flew by the Earth and missed us by a cosmic whisker. It flew well within the orbit of the moon. And anything flying within the orbit of the moon is considered to be dangerously close. Why? Because for one thing, when it comes that close to the Earth's gravity field can deflect it. Mm-hmm. And if it deflects it in such a way that it reduces the eccentricity of its orbit, that means that it now can potentially move closer to the Earth in its next passage, its next perigee, right? Now, it disappears, it goes around the sun, it comes back out. If it's and I don't know, I'll have to look up the some of what we now know in the aftermath of because there's been tracking of this object that has gone on since its discovery. So we know more about its orbital mechanics and stuff now than we did last summer, because it was discovered on June 16th, and then on June 29th, it came well within the orbit of the moon, right? So on June 29th of this year, and I wrote this and sent it out, I think, a couple of months later, well within the lunar orbit, asteroid 2024 MK, which was only discovered on June 16th, the asteroid was estimated to be up to 800 feet in diameter, making it roughly 150 times more massive than the Tunguska object. Now, if we remember, the Tunguska object was low density. Right. This is an asteroid. It's high density. It's in terms of its volume, it's 150 times bigger. But in terms of the potential energy that it's carrying, moving along, it's probably hundreds of times more than Tunguska.
Wow.
And we know Tunguska was large enough to have been equivalent to a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, which could take out any urban area on Earth, one bomb, right? Over 800 square miles, completely obliterated by Tunguska. Mm-hmm. Tunguska was about 150 feet in diameter. This thing was at least 500, maybe as much as 800 feet in diameter. With only a slightly different trajectory, this object could have collided with the Earth, causing an explosion with the power of at least 500 to 600 1-megaton hydrogen bombs. Oh. This is more than the combined energy of all nuclear weapons presently in the world. It would have blasted a crater somewhere about 2 miles wide and a half a mile, 2.5 miles wide and 1,500 feet deep. So imagine you're a geologist. This thing hits, and sometime subsequent to that, after the human race has picked up the pieces and sort of made a go at it again, you walk upon this hole in the ground. And you're looking out at a hole. It's 2.5 miles to the other side. It's 1,500 feet deep. Now, I don't know if you've ever visited Meteor Crater in Arizona, which is only a kilometer wide and 600 feet deep. And when you stand on that precipice and you imagine the amount of force and energy that excavated that hole, it's mind-blowing. If you were standing on a hole, on the rim of a hole, 2.5 miles wide and 1,500 feet deep, you'd be going, oh my fucking God, this is unreal.
We need to get off this planet is what I'd be saying.
Well, let's go on here. The fireball, when this thing hit, right, when it struck the ground, the fireball would have been over 3 miles in diameter. Now, I want you to just try to, and people who are going to be listening to this, I always encourage, do this. You know, look at a map, find where you are on the map, like your house, your office, whatever, and then use your scale of measure and find 1.5 miles in each direction and draw a circle, right? Now, then go outside. Once you've got that perspective, like, oh, it's 1.5 miles from here up to the interstate, whatever. You've got something you can gauge that distance. Then you imagine a ball of fire that's that wide, 3 miles wide, more than 3 miles wide. So imagine now if this impact was the West Coast, the East Coast, Europe, anywhere around the world that's densely populated, right? What would happen? Well, so in a densely populated area, such as the East Coast, the West Coast, whatever, more than 1 million people would be instantly incinerated, vaporized, as the fireball just, they would totally vaporize within the fireball. There would be absolutely nothing to show that they'd ever been here, no remains or anything. Then the blast wave would kill another 1 million people within probably seconds to a minute or two. The 240 decibel shock wave, in other words, the sound would be so loud that it would probably, just outside the immediate zone of incineration, anybody who somehow managed to survive just outside that, this 240 decibel shock wave would kill them. In other words, the sound would be so loud that it would kill them. You see, about 500,000 people would receive third-degree burns. Another 2.5 million would suffer from second-degree burns. Within 9 to 13 miles of the blast center, survivors would experience lung destruction and ruptured eardrums. Within 25 miles of the impact epicenter, trees would be knocked down and ignite into flames. Almost all or most buildings would collapse up to 22 miles from the impact site, and houses within 30 miles would be destroyed. A powerful earthquake, at least 6.3 on the Richter scale, would kill thousands more people and be felt up to 40 miles away. Peak wind speeds emanating outward from the blast would, at their peak, reach nearly 8,000 miles per hour. Inside of 20 miles, it would feel like you were inside an F5 tornado. Inside an F5 tornado. Now, that's the local. Now, an area, say, the size of the state of Pennsylvania is essentially gone. This is not even talking about the fallback that's going to ignite secondary fires. It's not even talking about the amount of dust and soot lofted into the atmosphere that's going to circle the globe and cause global cooling that probably lasts for 5 to 10 years. So now you've got agricultural collapse because of the so see, even though on the other side of the planet, yeah, you might feel the earth tremors as this thing strikes, But then within probably 24 hours, the sky would start darkening. And within the next 5 to 10 years, you'd just have the sun obscured because of the haze in the atmosphere.
Oh my
The
gosh.
temperatures would drop, agriculture would fail, and then you would have secondary consequences of millions of people succumbing to famine. And when these people when they become malnourished, their immune systems become compromised, the famine would then be followed by pestilent diseases so that's what just missed us last June. Just missed us by a whisker. And we're sitting here, you see, completely oblivious that almost every month, every couple of months, it's like the cosmos is going, hey, here's another shot across the bow. How many is it going to take before you guys, look upwards?
What do you think would happen if we looked up, Randall? What would happen for human consciousness?
I am afraid what's going to happen is we're going to have an impact. Listen, I'd settle for one. I think if we had an impact the size of Tunguska, that would be enough. I think it would shock people out of at least the ones that mattered.
Or maybe they'll listen to the Big Picture podcast and hear you talking about this, and they'll be excited about the idea of expansion.
Well, see, here's the thing. When ideas of further space exploration and economic development, colonization were first proposed back in the mid-'70s, when it dawned on engineers and physicists and thinkers and futurists and so on that, hey, the momentum that we've demonstrated is plausible within the last 10 to 15 years. If we continued that, we could become a spacefaring civilization within a generation. Well, we didn't go that route. But a lot of the objections, and I became, upon first learning about it, I became 100% an advocate for space continuing our sojourn, our journeys into space. And I would bring it up to people, discussions all the time. Once I started actually doing public lectures and presentations in 1980, I would bring it up. Mm-hmm. What I would hear invariably, over and over and over again. Well, we've got too many problems here on Earth we need to solve. We can't be wasting resources and time going into space until we've solved these problems here on Earth. My thought was, okay, maybe it's going to turn out that our problems that are here on Earth are not going to get solved until we start looking at the big picture. Mm-hmm. And of course, back then we didn't have the luxury of knowing what we know now, that we are cosmically vulnerable. We know that now. In 75, 76, 77, nobody was thinking about that.
It's almost deeply rooted in our experience as human beings right now that you hear stories about people in bad jobs or bad relationships or just in bad scenarios in their life, and they're like, well, I can't do anything about it until I fix this. I can't fix the other parts of my life. It's like this need for us to control this thing before we can look outward. And it's kind of a testament to the state of our consciousness or our species level of enlightenment currently, because we still fight among ourselves for finite resources when we could look outside.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've been engaged in a proxy war with Russia for a few years now, and ultimately what's driving that is control of what's assumed to be finite resources. Mm-hmm. We've talked about that. Ukraine is an incredible rich source of natural gas, coal, precious metals, industrial-grade metals, things that are worth trillions of dollars. And that's what it's ultimately about. Now, does it make sense for us to go to, world war, fighting over those resources? I think no. I think there's an alternative. And see, that's the outcome of the mindset that said, oh, we shouldn't go, we shouldn't expand. We shouldn't go to the higher frontier because we've got these problems here on Earth. But those problems here on Earth have only gotten worse. Now, we've cleaned up a lot of the pollution here in America, which is a good thing, very good thing. I mean, back in the 70s, you couldn't fish or swim in the Hudson River, for example. there was a lot more pollution. But America was in the final waning stages of that first phase industrial revolution coming out of World War II. And we we progressed, and one sign of that progression is we developed the technologies to not create a big polluting footprint in the environment, which I think is the natural progression of an evolving scientific, industrial, technological society. And that has been confirmed abundantly since then. And now the nations that are coming up behind us, who are now relatively where we were at 25, 30, 40 years ago, they're the ones doing most of the pollution, contributing most of the pollution. But if we keep evolving, which I think we will, as long as there's not forces of obstruction preventing us, we will evolve very quickly into a global civilization that is very much living symbiotically with the planet and restoring original habitats. There was just an article today about discovering that one of the large megafauna of South America, the tapir, one of the tapirs, species of tapirs, which was assumed to be extinct for the last 100 years, showed up. There was a mom and her babies. Oh, where'd that thing come from? So, you know, we're here, no question. I mean, we're here as guardians of the earth. I think that's really what we're all about. That's kind of for all the bad things we've done, our redemption as a species is we become guardians of the earth. We, the humans. And no other species can do that. But, you know, when you have a lot of the hand-wringers, you know, getting upset over the potential, like the same people that are talking about the sixth great mass extinction. Well, okay, I think that their motives are good. Their knowledge is insufficient to have an opinion on the matter, but their motives are good. Yeah, we want to save species, right? Well, what if in the saving of the species, you do things that actually will cause the destruction of species? For example, if you shut down fossil fuels and we have no energy, I mean, how do we save species? You know?
And you can't do that. Like, society would collapse as a whole if we stopped using fossil fuels.
Yes, it would. That's exactly what would happen. Now, people can throw up their hands in despair if they believe the narrative that's been propagated that the fossil fuel consumption, which is increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is capable of triggering a major climate apocalypse. But it's not.
It's not.
It isn't. No. Does it cause changes in the environment? Yes, it does, but a lot of things do. And the role of carbon dioxide as the control knob on the climate has been way over-exaggerated, in my humble opinion. And that's something that needs to be talked about more. And now, actually, we can talk about that openly. We had 4 years, whenever we've had Democratic administrations, we find that to talk about a lot of things has been suppressed. We know that the social media sites were being pressured by the Biden administration to not allow certain conversations. I mean, we know that. That's been confirmed. They were pressuring social media to not allow certain conversations to take place in the public sector, in the public sphere. And social media more or less knuckled under, but I don't see, I mean, listen, I'm far from going blindsided, you know, with sunshine and rainbows as far as the Trump administration. But certainly it looks like we can now have conversations without interference that we wouldn't have had a year ago. And all of the hysterics, the anti-Trump hysterics, are so just completely deranged and irrational, and focused on it. Just like, here's this stuff, Russian collusion, rapist, racist, all of this stuff that's just thrown into the propaganda mill, and you've got a large segment of the population just basically gobbling it up, and that becomes their reality. And now they have no objective awareness of what's really going on in the world anymore.
I mean, right now there's mass disclosure happening. It's so much happening that it's very hard to keep up with. We'll probably have to dedicate another episode
Oh, yeah.
to the disclosure that's just been going on because
Yes.
as somebody who's consistently trying to follow all of these things that are being revealed, it's extremely difficult to do that, which shows, hopefully, is a sign of exactly what you're talking about, that we'll be able to communicate more freely about things, and it won't just be us in the trenches fighting in the Colosseum, that our governments and people who hold a lot of the keys, or at least can shut the blinds or open them how they would like, want to leave them open and want more stuff to come through and allow the people to come to their own conclusions, to start to do their own research.
Yes, to come to their own conclusions and do their own research. And I think when I see some of this stuff online and hear some of the stuff coming from that side of the political spectrum, it's like, okay, you people, and I live in a sea of liberalism here. There was not one Trump sign in my neighborhood, plenty of Biden signs, not one Trump sign. Although I did know a few people who were going to vote for Trump in my neighborhood, but they didn't put up signs.
They were closeted.
They were closeted, yes. And so I've not engaged really any of my neighbors since the election, although some of the stuff I see people, someone on Facebook, some of these people I've known for years and years, and I see the stuff they're posting, and I'm like, what happened to you? You used to drive around in the 80s. You had a Question Authority bumper sticker on your car. Now, you're totally invested in this made-up narrative. You're totally bought into it. What the hell happened? Yeah. I've known you. I knew you back in the day. I thought you were cool. Now look, what in the world happened? And I'm a bit of a loss to explain that.
I think we're headed to, you said this earlier, and it's entirely possible that we can become a global civilization. Mm-hmm. And a two-party system might be the best way for democracy to run or a government to run, because it makes things, it could make things more simple. But the two-party ideology, the two parts of, it's this way or this way, and you have to wrap up your identity in it, is what is stopping us from becoming global civilization, or at least taking steps towards that. Because this is all about coordination at the end of the day. And if there are people who are continuously fighting you because of what they interpret as your beliefs or your ideas or your identity, and that's just what they want to attack, versus having two people who may have different ideas, different beliefs, looking at the same thing and trying to work together towards it, that's where progress comes, because you have creative tension. And you essentially have, that's where like Hegel's dialectic happens. You have a thesis and antithesis, and you come to a synthesis. And that's how we coordinate. And there is where we might find ourselves looking to the cosmos and saying, okay, well, we've got a technological problem. So how are we going to get there? But we also have to not blow ourselves up and kill each other in the process of getting there and creating a new civilization. So what do we do, Randall? What are the answers for our enlightenment as a species?
Well, first of all, we need leadership that's willing to dialogue with anybody and without conditions. Yeah, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk this out before we start shooting each other, right? Shooting each other is a response of last resort, not first resort.
I mean, how often do you get in a conflict where you end up punching somebody in the face or pulling a gun out?
Yeah.
Not
right.
often.
Right. So what I'm hoping is that I'm keeping my fingers crossed, and I'm going to do my part. We are going to do our part in trying to put out this game plan that, look, there's this tremendous opportunity sitting right in front of us. All we have to do is reach out. All we have to do is get organized, get fired up, seize the vision, seize the opportunity, exercise some willpower and go for it. Fucking go for it. You know? What's the alternative? The alternative is that we're going to sit here competing and fighting each other over a supposed finite pie that if we don't use whatever necessary force to claim our share, it's going to be taken by the other guy, and we're going to be fighting over this ever-diminishing pie when that is not the real situation at all. And that's what we need to do. We need to pull together. I mean, look.
Yeah.
Look, Trump is already talking to Xi Jinping. I am hoping he actually talks to Putin. And all of these people who go, oh, Putin stooge and this and that. I hope Trump turns around to those people and does this.
Unfortunately, this week we did not get good news on that, but
we didn't.
We hopefully can still look to the future and say, hopefully the proxy war that's going on in Ukraine and between I guess you could say Russia and the UN, it gets put in perspective for people. I mean, what do you think happens first, out of curiosity? Do you think that we become a spacefaring civilization or a global civilization, and then we learn to coordinate, we learn to evolve? So we go to space, we see all this opportunity, and then we stop fighting amongst ourselves as the starting point? Or do you think we stop fighting amongst ourselves and then we go to space?
I would think I'm inclined to the second option is kind of what I think. Although I think once we go to space, I mean, here's the thing. The magnitude of that enterprise is so gigantic that, you know, the analogy I always use, and I might have used it with you before, but I'll say it again. You know, I go out to the Pacific Northwest. I spend a lot of time and have spent a lot of time exploring mega flood features in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the areas that's really interesting, both from the standpoint of because where this great ice dam was, is where the greatest dam in North America is, Grand Coulee Dam. Mm-hmm. It's a massive dam, some over 400 feet high and a mile and a half wide. Well, it's a mile across the span, and then it does a right angle, I think, for another half mile. So the totality, I mean, it's huge. And it was the biggest engineering undertaking in the world at the time, in the 30s when it was built. And when the government under Roosevelt decided that they wanted to, that was all part of this reclamation project, they had two ideas in mind. Number one, when it was built, they were already planning war. They were already planning, World War III was already being planned by the really, within a few years into Roosevelt's administration. By the time you get to 37, 38, they're already looking forward. They're seeing, reading the signs. They know that Germany is remilitarizing and rearming. They know this conflict is coming. They deliberately devise a strategy to actually provoke this conflict. Well, there was a twofold reason. Number one, there was a domestic rationale, which was a good thing, and then a military and foreign policy rationale was that once they had it in mind that we might build an atomic bomb, it was known that we were going to need facilities, and those facilities were going to consume a whole lot of energy, a whole lot of water, and so the Hanford reactor site was developed along the Columbia River and powered by the power generated by the hydroelectric dam at Grand Coulee. And the other thing was a whole series of canals and aqueducts were built to irrigate the Luss Plateau. And Luss is the topsoil that's very, very fertile. It's a lot of volcanic material in it, probably some cosmic material. But this whole basalt plateau of southeastern Washington is blanketed in this Luss, this very fertile topsoil. But what is lacking is the water. It's a semi-arid environment. So they realized, well, we'll build this big dam. It'll create Lake Roosevelt. That'll be a reservoir, and we'll be able to draw that water. We'll be able to generate hydroelectric power, and that will fuel the war effort, plus a huge amount of electrical power. Then we'll be able to irrigate the plateau region, and that's what they did. So now there's agriculture, and you look at it from space, you're going to see very clearly the agriculture that's going on there. So, anyways, when they wanted to let that out to bid, there was nobody who was singularly capable. They went out to top engineering firms in the country. I don't remember the names of them, who they were, but they went out to the top engineering firms of the country looking for bids to build this thing. And it was beyond the capabilities of any existing entity. How did it get built? Well, how it became built is 3 former competitors with each other joined forces. Mm-hmm. They formed a consortium. They joint ventured the construction of Grand Coulee Dam. And that's how it was done. And that's how we have to do it. Because let's say building an international outpost on the moon, that's going to be a big project. And everybody can get involved. There's room enough for the Russians. There's room enough for the Chinese. There's room enough for the Japanese. There's room enough for the Arabs and the Indians. The Indians they're moving ahead with the space program, as are the Chinese. They're going to move ahead into space whether America does or doesn't. And if we don't get our asses in gear, in another few years, we're going to be in 3rd or 4th place as far as the space program. Now, coming back to the political angle again, what the whole left is pushing for? They're pushing for taxing billionaires out of existence. I mean, that's literally the program that they want to advance. Tax billionaires out of it. Oh, well, we could tax Elon Musk or whoever 90% of their money, and they would still have hundreds of millions of dollars, and nobody needs more than hundreds of millions of dollars, right? That's pretty much the rationale that's coming out from that side of the political spectrum, right? Well, so what do you do with that money? Okay, well, so you give it to politicians. And that's going to be a better use for that money. We'll give the politicians trillions of dollars, and they can go spend it on our pet programs, right? Well, here's the thing. If you tax those billionaires out of existence, say goodbye to the civilian space program. Now, how important is the civilian space program right now? I would say
fucking important.
Very fucking important. That's right. That's exactly
It's
right.
the only meaningful thing going on in the pursuit of becoming a spacefaring civilization. Maybe not the only meaningful thing, but by far making the most progress.
Yes. That's right. That's exactly right. So it all becomes down to the vision and the will. And, George Gurdjieff, he was that Armenian spiritual teacher, used to say that we're on a cosmic timetable and we're behind schedule. And that's what he used to say. And when I first read it, in the early 70s, I didn't really understand what he meant. Eventually, I get what he means now. The other thing is that he says most people are going to continue to sleep until there's a shock that wakes them up. And I think that's also pretty much true. And what would be the shock?
Unfortunate but true.
Unfortunate but true. Yeah, unfortunate but true. So what would be the shock in this case? Well, the shock, I think, would be another demonstration of cosmic power a la Tunguska event.
Hopefully that's all it is.
Hopefully that's all it is.
Hopefully we don't blow ourselves up.
Well, that's why we need grassroots saying, look, there's no insurmountable issue dividing us.
Because there's not.
There's not. No, there isn't.
That's not real. That is driven by other factors of essentially having wealth transfer. People want to have more money. They want to have more power. So it's manufactured. Right.
But, see, it's like, yes, the Malthusian, as long as we're confined, limited to an exclusively terrestrial existence, well, yeah, then the Malthusian model does apply to some extent, although unless, I'm still not convinced the source of oil. It may be abiotic, and if it's abiotic, and the reservoirs are in fact replenishing themselves, well, but the other thing is we've got new technologies that are on the threshold of going mainstream in the next few years, and that's going to change the equation completely. And it's going to completely alter our relationship with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels will still be used, but not to the extent that they are now. And I, for one, don't want to stop using fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I want to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we're using, yes. Do I want to eliminate our use? No, I don't. Why don't I? The reason is if the Earth cools naturally, let's say the sun goes into one of its solar minimum phases for a century or two. What's going to happen is the oceans are then going to cool down after a few decades, and once they do, they're going to start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Just like they did, during the Great Ice Age, they sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it went down to 180 parts per million. I mean, if it had gone down much lower than that, the biosphere is going to start dying off. At 150 parts per million, there's not enough CO2 pressure in the atmosphere to cause photosynthesis. What happens then? So you look at the whole history of life on Earth and the relationship, the concentrations of CO2, which we can now reconstruct by looking at fossil leaves, because the stomatal density of fossil leaves is a function of the CO2 pressure in the atmosphere. In other words, as the pressure increases, the apertures to draw in the CO2 to trigger photosynthesis, they diminish in size, right? And that also means they preserve water. They become much more effective at preserving water. Well, so what we've seen is by looking at fossilized leaves, is we can see these changes in stomatal density of fossilized leaves. And that is a direct proxy for CO2 concentrations. The other way, of course, that we estimate ancient concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere is ice cores. But those could be problematic. Those results have been challenged, right? Because how do you get a bubble in an ice core that's an exact replica of the constituent atmospheric gases in the global atmosphere at the time that bubble forms? When you start thinking about it, you go, okay, yeah, I can see how it might be problematic. Typically, there's 80 to 100 years between the time that snow falls on top of the glacier before that snow becomes frozen as part of the glacier mass. It goes through a transitionary phase called firn, F-I-R-N, in which it becomes more and more compacted. And then at some point after 80 to 100 years or so, with 80 to 100 years of snowfall on top of it, it will transform into glacial ice. And only then do the air bubbles get trapped. Now, as the ice accumulates on top of it, those bubbles are subjected to pressure. Now, when you drill an ice core, there's a major pressure release that occurs. Now, it has been challenged by some of the ice core experts that maybe those bubbles and the concentration of CO2 that's in those bubbles is more a reflection of the pressure regime to which those bubbles are subjected. Even if there's more gas, more CO2 in the atmosphere, as they get subjected to pressure from the overlying accumulation of glacial ice, they might outgas. And that's a realistic problem. Now, here's the thing. If you've got CO2 in the atmosphere, right, and it's cold out like an ice age, well, then the oceans are sucking. They're sucking that CO2 out of the atmosphere. And it would not take long, if that was not replenished naturally or by any means at all, the CO2, because what happens once it goes into the ocean? Well, now you've got all of these little benthic and planktonic creatures in the water column that incorporate that carbon dioxide into the manufacture of their shells, right? So then what happens? The little, they're called foraminifera and others. Those are one of the most prominent of these little, some of them are microscopic, some of them are macroscopic, but they're consuming that CO2 and it gets locked into their shells. They die, they filter to the bottom, and then the pressure builds up as layer after layer, the centuries, and that lithifies into limestone rock. Now, once that carbon dioxide gets incorporated into those shells and becomes part of the limestone rock, hey, it ain't part of the carbon cycle anymore. It's out until something liberates it from being locked up, maybe for tens or hundreds of millions of years, see? Now, there has to be a mechanism for replenishing the carbon dioxide. Now, how do you do that? Well, somehow, for most of life history on Earth, you see that carbon dioxide was 1,000 parts per million or more. And you see there was a couple of dips where it went way down low, dangerously low, because again, if it goes down to 150 parts per million, the biosphere starts dying off. Plants can't breathe. They suffocate, right? So what you see, though, is you see this wave like this. Sometimes it got real low, but the lowest it's been since life began, the lowest it's been was late glacial maximum at 180 parts per million. And we're just coming out of that. Mm-hmm. So it's like Al Gore can say, oh, well, as long as we have looked, this has never fluctuated. It's never changed. That's bullshit. The fact of the matter is, though, at 180 parts per million, that's as low as it's been in the whole history of life on Earth. Right? Now, what are we doing? We're burning some fossil fuel and we're replenishing some of we've been in a carbon dioxide drought for 2.5 million years. Okay? Whatever switch was flipped 2.5 million years ago that transitioned the planet from the warm Pliocene into the cold Pleistocene and inaugurated this cycle of glacial, interglacial ages, whatever that was, whether it was solar, whatever it was, there was probably also evidence now of a major impact at 2.6 million years ago. But whatever that was, what happened then is that with the ice ages, it started sucking the carbon dioxide down. And so now it got down to 180 parts per million. And we, by burning our fossil fuel, have pumped it back up to it's a little over 400 parts.
Yeah, you hear that, people? Do your part. Buy a truck. Drive it every day. You got to be a part of the good. You got to be a part of the replenishment. We want the plants to live.
Well, and see, most people that are busily drinking the propaganda Kool-Aid don't understand the bimodal functioning of carbon dioxide. It serves two great functions within the natural order. One, it's a greenhouse gas. Using that as a loose analogy, it's a greenhouse gas. It captures long wave thermal radiation emanating from land and trees and ground and the earth, emanating from the earth, right? It allows the passage of shortwave wavelength, like when you're in the ultraviolet, passes right through.
Right.
When it's in the infrared, within the visible spectrum, particularly around 16, 17 microns, it tends to get captured until the atmospheric envelope becomes saturated. Now, just like a sponge, if we took a sponge and set on your desk there and it's totally dry and you start pouring water on it, you'll keep pouring, and that water will disappear. You won't see it. At some point, the sponge gets saturated, the water leaks out. That's what happens with the atmosphere. We're long past the saturation point from carbon. The carbon dioxide window was filled for the most part, a couple of hundred parts per million ago. And it also overlaps totally with water vapor, which is also the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, which is already occupying the same window, that same 15, 16, 17 micron window that is occupied by greenhouse carbon dioxide. So the point here is that it's like, okay, so it's capturing heat. And we can pull up some interesting graphs here in a minute if you want to look at it. You'll see that the first 50 to 100 parts per million is doing the bulk of the heat capture. And then it tapers off in a reverse exponential curve, right, from that point on. Well, about the same time, the thermal capture function of carbon dioxide is ceasing. That's when its photosynthetic capabilities kick in. And that happens between like 150 and 200 parts per million, see? So at 200 parts per million, carbon dioxide is not capturing much heat anymore. But now it is functioning as a photosynthetic machine that's drawing the CO2 out of the atmosphere, consuming the carbon dioxide and releasing an oxygen molecule into the air that we lung-breathing creatures, terrestrial lung-breathing creatures, can now breathe.
Yeah.
So what happens when you start sucking all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Well, it's not replenishing the atmosphere of oxygen anymore, see? Yeah, there's just been this whole big fear porn created around carbon dioxide. It's ridiculous. It needs to be denounced. Trump did exactly the right thing withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, because that had nothing to do with preventing the climate from changing, which it would not do at all under any
Right.
circumstances. What it's totally about is a big shakedown. It's about major wealth transfer from the developed nations to favored developing nations, which of course are all on board, with their hands out. And of course, the United States, of course, is supposed to be the big supplier of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, because of, in the name of climate justice.
Right.
Which is just, I don't even know.
Yeah, it's something that we got to get out of the way of our thinking. I think some people don't have the knowledge or the data, the education to be able to prove this incorrectly, and they're coming at it from what they think is a good place. They're like, okay, well, I'm trying to do this from a good perspective, but the implications of this are, I've heard people say this repeatedly. It's like, oh, well, we don't want rockets, like, because they produce so much pollution. Like, okay, well, that's a very, very minuscule amount of carbon dioxide produced from the fossil fuels that are burned and that. But it's just standing in the way of our ability to look at technological progress and development. If we are creating more pollution, let's say, well, what have we done as human beings? As we advance and as we have more energy to harness, then we also figure out more efficient ways to do it. We also figure out better ways to mitigate damages. We figure out new things. We don't, when repeatedly when people are trying to stop progress, it just stands in the way of our creative ability. When people are putting boundaries around what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, you can't play here, you can't try this, then we stifle ourselves and limit our ability to solve problems, which is what we're always trying to do.
And there's always unintended consequences of that interference. Mm-hmm. And I would say to some of the people that we don't want to, rockets, they pollute the atmosphere. And yeah, well, they do to some extent, yes. Although that could change. Again, we know that there are technologies pending that could completely alter the industrial civilization. But I would also say to them, okay, if that is, if a peacetime space exploration program should be suppressed, should be prohibited because of potential pollution, what about the wars that are going on, which are actually producing much worse pollution and environmental degradation by far than the launching of those rockets? Are you out on the front lines of the anti-war movement? If you're not, don't talk to me about Elon Musk's or Seth, what's his name? Amazon. Jeff Bezos. Don't talk to me about their rockets if you're not out on the front lines of the anti-war movement, because that's where we start. Because, there's just that when you think about the damage that's done to infrastructure that required energy to create, then the amount of energy consumed in destroying it, and then the amount of energy to recreate it or to rebuild it. So now, here we are, Trump is talking about America taking over Gaza. I didn't know what to think of that. Is it tongue in cheek or is this serious? And I started thinking about it. The more I thought about it is, okay, So the damage is done. 3/4 of Gaza's gone. It's rubble. All the hospitals are gone. The schools, the universities, the cultural centers. Like 80% of residences are rubble. So what now happens to the Gazans that have survived this onslaught here? Do we say, okay, you guys can go back? And they go back and they squat under rubble? Or do we move you out into a desert and give you a bunch of tents? Is that the response? What happens now? And nobody is really, unless, well, so initially my response to the, okay, America should take over Gaza is, well, no, that's not the solution. That's not the moral and ethical solution. But then that led me to think, well, what is the solution? And I know where the pressure is going with it. I mean, because what you've got there could be another, Monaco. I mean, it's, the resources off the coast there of the Eastern Mediterranean, the climate, the environment. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you want to go in and create a big development and turn it into another, French Riviera or something like that, okay, well, what about the Gazans? That's the problem. So I'm thinking, are there historical precedents? Well, sort of like, let's look at the indigenous people of America. They got screwed big time, no question. Okay, but a couple of things happened. One was more or less a discovery, a natural discovery, as some of the reservations discovered that they had been moved out to Oklahoma and places like that. And it turned out that underneath them was a bunch of oil. And if they were savvy enough and knew how to game the system or play the system in their favor, some of them got very rich. Then there was policy changes that said, okay, well, we're going to outlaw gambling except for Indian reservations. And now there are tribes that are multimillionaires, maybe even billionaires, right? Now, obviously, what happened to them was wrong, horribly, horribly wrong. But it's historical. I mean, we can't undo it. We can't undo it. What can we do, though, is try to rectify the injustice. Now, there's a lot of talk now about reparations, as far as to black people because of slavery. My thought there is that, well, my problem is that how do you actually administer such a thing? Because so many of the people living in America today had nothing to do with that conflict. It was only a small percentage of slave owners in the South. So you can't blame all white people. And after all, I mean, you had 600,000 plus people die in the Civil War, half of them who were Union soldiers who were presumably fighting, at least according to the narrative, fighting to end slavery. So you had one side that was fighting supposedly to end slavery, and the other side supposedly fighting to preserve slavery, although in reality, I think it's clear that the real basis was economic, but that's a whole other discussion we should have at some point. But in either case, if the Union soldiers loses 250,000 soldiers, I mean, isn't that kind of some kind of a repayment, right? I mean, one would think. I don't know how to parse out the morality of that, the moral implications. But certainly, there's a lot of crap going on in Africa right now. Violence, intertribal, internecine strife, and has been, right? Now, there's a lot of black folks in America that have, and the conservatives and libertarians know this, and a bunch of them are my heroes. Thomas Sowell and people like him who are free thinkers that know, yeah, look, we're in a position. There's nothing holding us back. As you now can be treated as an individual. It's only the diversity, equity, and inclusion crowd that is looking for first and foremost at race and gender and this and that, whereas conservative and libertarian blacks are like, hey, we don't need all this extra stuff. We just like what's his name, the great anti-slave fighter, in the Civil War times. He'll come to me in a second.
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, another one of my heroes, somebody I should know his name right off the top of him. He said, "We don't need any special favors. All we need is freedom. All we need is our own skills, our own awareness, and we will do fine." That was his message. And I think it's as true now as it was then. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that you've got people, you've got Chinese that came to America who, of course, were also subject to enormous abuse and the story behind the Chinese. And we've seen it even here. I know, like my accountant is a Vietnamese immigrant, and he's now quite wealthy. He came here to America. He worked hard. He learned accounting, got really good at it, started a firm, and he's been our accountant now for about 15 years. And he's very well off. His family is well off. The whole family works together. They work there in the office. They're a tight-knit family. And I've known a lot of immigrants that have prospered over, when I was living in the 70s in Atlanta, I lived in some old post-World War II townhomes. A lot of my neighbors were immigrants from, a lot of Cubans were there. Because this is when a lot of the Cuban immigrants were fleeing communism. So I had Cuban neighbors, I had Hispanic neighbors, I had black neighbors, and I had Vietnamese neighbors because the war had just ended in Vietnam, and a lot of the Vietnamese that fought alongside American soldiers were allowed to emigrate to America. So there was a lot of Vietnamese that came in the mid-70s that have now totally prospered. They came here, established businesses, and so on. Well, it's not a matter of your color of your skin or your ethnicity, your religious beliefs or anything. It's your willingness to just work and your commitment to do something. And I think every race has its people who are superior and do that and are accomplished. They're creative. They're constructive. Etc. And then you've got, look, I go up in certain areas and I see some of these rural areas up in Kentucky where I've been hiking and, I don't even want to use the term, but I will anyway, white trash. Now, when I say white trash, I don't mean to cast aspersions on a broad economic spectrum of human society. But I've gone into some of these places hiking and I get to here's a place where a lot of the locals hang out, a park. And I'm hiking through it, and there's piles of trash everywhere. And I'm going, okay, somebody comes in here with their trailer or they're camping out or whatever, and they leave a pile of trash behind. Well, that pile of trash is to me like a symbol of, that's white trash that did that. And I know it's all uneducated people, white people, that are coming there, they're doing that, right? They just don't know any better. But am I out of line to judge those people? I don't think so. You don't judge them by the fact that the color of their skin. You judge them by their behavior, by their actions. Now, what does all this have to do with the main point I was making? Well, it comes back to the situation that we've now got. You got a couple of million Palestinians that, what do we do? What's their fate? We're not going to just line them up and put them in gas chambers. No, we're not. So what becomes of them, right? Well, now I'm thinking, okay, like in the last 5 to 10 years, I've been to a lot of conferences and things. So I don't gamble, so I have no reason to go to a casino. But I've been through a lot of casinos recently because of different conferences and things that I've attended that are in hotels that are part of casino complexes. And I walked through there, like I was in an Apache casino recently, last year. A couple of times I've been there now, and, it's all Native Americans working in there. Native Americans are making huge amounts of money there. They're driving nice cars. They're living in nice homes now. And if you ask them if they would be willing to trade all of that to go back to whatever, I'm assuming probably most of them would not, right? So what happened to their ancestors was wrong. It was unjust. It was horrible. It shouldn't have happened. But it did happen. So the generations that come later have to be pragmatic about what is our response to this injustice that was perpetrated upon these people. Well, in that case, I'm 100% for reparations if we can say, okay, this was the people that perpetrated the injustice. These were the people that were victims of that injustice. Yes, these actual people, yeah, it would be fine for reparations to transfer these people to be held accountable for what they did to this group. But if it's 4 or 5 generations ago and you don't even know, are you even descended from slaves? Are you even descended from slave owners? Well, your ancestors didn't come here until the 20th century. Well, how are you now responsible for slavery in America? Do we take that slavery back to the beginning? Well, most accounts of slavery, and I know there's going to be some blowback from what I'm saying here, but a lot of accounts of slavery start with the transatlantic slave trade. They ignore the fact that when the Dutch, the Portuguese, the British, and everything went to Africa, they didn't go into the interior and capture slaves. They purchased or traded for slaves that were already on the slave market. You see, that's a fact that needs to be recognized because it's a historical fact. And to cite that historical fact is not to be racist at all. Because back then, when you go back at that point, slavery was endemic to all kinds of cultures. You know, look, the word slave comes from Slavic, right? The Slavs were white people, right? Think about that. Yeah. So
I have Slavic descent. My girlfriend is considered Slavic.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you think, what do you hope people understand about? I mean, you rolled out a lot of situations that have commonalities in them, and then there's one that's right in front of us right now with the Palestinians in Gaza. And we've been talking about how history is something that we should be paying attention to in order to understand how important it is for us to be able to relate and move forward, become a spacefaring civilization.
Well, let's address that. But I'll make one last point with regards to what we were just talking about. Let's assume now that the pressure is on to develop that place as another French Riviera.
Right.
Okay. Well, that means that that land is extremely valuable. It means that the economic return on investment could be huge. It could be considerable. I want to see that go to Palestinians. I want them to have choice. I want first dibs on the jobs it's going to generate. I want them to share in the wealth that would be generated. There's thousands and thousands of orphans now. How about some of the development money goes to build state-of-the-art orphanages, hospitals, schools, etc. And if America is going to take it over, well, there's no place for an apartheid entity there anymore. America's built upon the idea that in front of the law, we're all equal. Doesn't matter about your race, your religion, your ethnicity, your philosophy. None of that matters, right? All men and women are created equal. And we have, think about this, we have, for the most part, banished that kind of bigotry. The bigotry is still there, but it's not overt. Mm-hmm. You can't deny service to somebody, because of the color of their skin anymore, or because you don't like some. Now, of course, in the private sector, I think you have the right to do business with whomever you want. But the point is, we've really moved beyond. We've moved beyond segregation. We're not we were when I was a kid, we were an apartheid country in the South. We're not anymore, right?
Right.
We're not, right? Israel, by any definition of the word, and I've known enough Palestinians. I've read enough about the whole situation, the history of it. I know enough that basically, and my wife is Middle Eastern Studies. She's got a degree in Middle Eastern Studies. She's been there. She's known and traveled and stayed with Palestinians in the West Bank. She was refused entry into Gaza by the IDF. They wouldn't let her in. This was back, I don't know, let's see, when was this? Early 2012 maybe. I forget the
Wow.
year she was there. Yeah. She went and she stayed with Palestinian families that had been, like, she stayed with a Palestinian family that had been run off their farm, that had been in their family for like 300 years. And they were forcibly removed from their farm, and settlers were brought in, and the farm was given to them. Now, this is stuff that's been going on. Mainstream media won't touch it because the lobbying and all of that.
Right.
But so, okay, Trump comes out and says, well, America should take over Gaza. And I say, okay, well, you know what? I might get behind that idea. If you want to develop Gaza, and now it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars, this sea resort, on the Eastern Mediterranean, another French Riviera. Well, I want to see some of that go to reparations to the people that have suffered. I want those children that have lost their parents, I want them taken care of. I want them to be able to have jobs there. I want them to be able to go back and live in high quality housing. And I want no discrimination, no segregation. I want everybody there to be treated the same exactly as they would in America. And if you promise me that, maybe I would get on board. Only because I can't conceive of an alternative scenario. Well, I mean, what is the alternative at this point? Gaza's rubble. That's what it is. It's just rubble. Mile after mile, thousands and thousands of acres of rubble. So you can't do anything with that until all that rubble is cleaned up. Of course, that's going to be a hellacious problem. My God, that's going to, and think about the energy that's going to be. And, contaminated water, asbestos, because of in the old buildings is contaminating everything. Thousands upon thousands of corpses rotting under the rubble. All that's going to have to be dealt with. It's so what's the answer? Well, the answer, I think, is okay, yeah. And it shouldn't have come to this. It should not have come to this. But the fact is now,
It has.
it did. It happened. Yeah. So now we can't go, oh, this or that should have happened. Yeah, we know that. We know that. That shouldn't have happened. Hamas shouldn't have attacked on October 7th, and the retaliation of Israel shouldn't have happened on the scale it did. In fact, Israel, which brags about its preeminent premier intelligence agencies, should have gone in and done a little bit of interrogation, a little investigation, and literally found the actual people that were behind planning and executing October 7th and arrested them. But that's not what happened. What happened was the equivalent of a school shooter goes into a school and shoots a bunch of students, runs away and takes refuge in a house in a neighborhood and holds the people in the house hostage. And then in order to get the shooter, you go in and you bomb and blow up the entire neighborhood and kill everybody in it. That's essentially what happened. But it's done now. So, I mean, Netanyahu is going to have to, he's going to have to answer for what he did and his supporters. But then there's the aftermath. What happens? And I know there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction from the Trump haters that if he says that is the most horrible thing, proves that he's a Nazi, et cetera, proves that he's a dictator. Yet then I would ask these people, what do you think should happen? What's your plan? It's happened. You helped. You are an enabler. If you're an American citizen, you're an enabler of that. It was your tax money and your dollars that funded that. It was your government. You voted for the Biden administration. The whole thing was done. It didn't happen under Trump. It happened under Joe Biden. You voted for him. Okay, so I think you have some responsibility. What is your plan for what we do now? What is your plan to bring justice to the surviving Palestinians? I want to hear that. And until you can come up with something that makes sense, shut the fuck up.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a catastrophe.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it is. It's a sad thing that's happened. Yeah. Well,
so,
not even to move away from that topic, but to
you want to get back to.
I just you know me, Randall. I'm kind of an altruistic person to some extent. I'm excited about the future.
Oh, me too. Yeah.
I hope that we don't have. I hope that this is another example of something that we don't want to keep doing as a people, as humanity. And the scenario that you've just painted, I mean, it could be an example for when these things do happen, what do we do as Americans? What does America do in this scenario? Can they do? It's all about making the best move on the board.
Yeah.
People always think like, oh, it's got to be the perfect move. Well, most of the time, the perfect move is not available. You make the best move on the board. And if we could make the best move, then this could be something that people look to in the future and decide that, okay, we don't want to do these things, and where there has been injustice, where there's been these terrible scenarios, we have a solution that we can pursue. Because kind of the whole point of this is it's bringing people back together once again. Instead of creating a farther divide, instead of it being unapproachable, what we do is we bring people back together and we unify. Yes, there's going to be conflicts. There probably always will be. But the more that we can conflict and then unify and find a better future together, then we'll continue to be able to go through scenarios that we grow from, and we don't just go in this, really this downward cycle that's vicious and just eats itself.
Right. In a way, there's a quote, some interesting quotes from Ray Bradbury. Remember him? Did you ever read Ray Bradbury?
No, I didn't. I don't think I read Ray Bradbury.
He was one of my favorites. Let's see. Fahrenheit 451 was one of his famous books, kind of along the lines of 1984 by Orwell and, what's his name?
He also wrote The Veldt, The Martian Chronicles.
The Martian Chronicles, Something Wicked This Way Comes, Dandelion Wine, a bunch of them. Yeah, he was one of my absolute favorite authors as a kid growing up. I pretty much read anything and everything that Ray Bradbury wrote. R is for Rocket, etc. Anyways, he was a big advocate of space colonization. And I love this quote. This is not all. I wish I had the whole quote here. I only have part of it, but the part that I do have is excellent. He says, this was in 1977. Colonies in space? The question really shouldn't be raised. For me, anyway. It is self-answering. Yes, of course. Why not? Let's move. Let's go there. Let's do the job. And he goes on, I've skipped over some parts, and he says, wherever we will go with our colonies, we will bring summer in the midst of a long winter of time. Each of us is a hearth, each of us a small solar furnace digesting frosts and speaking suns. Man imprisons himself in his own Bastille, not noticing he has the keys in his hand. Anytime he wishes, he can unlock, step forth, fly, be free. We must become citizens of the universe. The universe says no to us. We, in answer, fire a broadside of flesh at it and cry, yes. Other worlds do not live. We'll stir them with our limbs. Other parts of the universe cannot see. We will bring a gift of eyes. Where all is silence, this thing we call human will speak.
Let's do this. Let's do the job. I love it.
You ever read the Treatise on Initiations by Asclepius? Revelation of Asclepios.
Is that Hermetic?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I think I have. I've read through most of those. Say it again. What's the title of it?
A Treatise on
Oh
Initiations
yeah,
by Asclepius.
yeah, yeah. This is. I mean, there's a collection of. I bought a collection of books that include the Kybalion and
Oh,
the
yeah.
the three emerald tablets and the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, however you pronounce it.
So this was the god was speaking to Asclepius. And Asclepius was despairing the fate and condition of mankind, his fellow species. And here's a few things that the god spoke to Asclepius and said, "Man, then, Asclepius, is a great marvel, a creature worthy of respect and adoration. For amid this divine nature, he moves as if he himself were a god. In joining himself to the divine, man disdains that which he has in him of the earthly. He connects himself by a bond of love to all other beings and thereby feels himself necessary to the universal order. He contemplates heaven, and in this happy middle sphere in which he is placed, he loves all that is below him. He is beloved of all that is above. He cultivates the earth. He borrows the speed of the elements. His piercing thought fathoms the deep of the sea. Everything is clear for him. Heaven does not seem to him too high, for knowledge lifts him to it." So
We are this beautiful middle sphere. I've never heard. I don't think I've ever heard it described, or I don't remember reading that. But we do exist in this state. It feels like in betweens where we can grasp and play with the above. Maybe even if it's just in our minds, but we find ourselves constantly in interaction with the below. Or I guess you could say with anything that we experience in our existence as human beings, other species, and nature around us, and our ability to relate with it and to consistently develop and change and actually adapt the environment around us and adapt to the environment around us is kind of what separates us from most other things. And it could be frustrating to some, you know.
well, it's just the mindset that once upon a time I think was prevalent in America, that built this country, that brought us from feudalism into the space age. It was audacious, to say the least, that we were able to do this in a couple of centuries. And I think that was a mindset that did that, a consciousness of our own the possibilities, the infinite possibilities, and our own capabilities of realizing that potential and those possibilities. The initiation goes on to say this, and this ends it. It ends with this. He's talking to Asclepius, and he says, talking about mankind, humankind, "They will pursue the inmost secrets of nature, even into the heights, and will study the motions of the heavens. Nor is this enough. When nothing yet remains to be known than the furthest boundary of the earth, they will seek even there the last extremities of the night. If they apprehend no obstacle, if they live exempt from trouble, beyond reach of any fear or of any anxiety, even heaven itself will not arrest their audacity." It's like, let's go for it.
Let's do it.
Let's go for it. So, let's do a little bit of quick screen share here, and look at some of these possibilities that are before us. And I find no better analog for our own times than the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages, mankind was given a little reprieve of a couple, 2 to 3 centuries of warm weather, abundant rainfall, abundant crops. The population increased hugely, lifespans increased, Infant mortality decreased. There was surplus agriculture. People had plenty to eat. They were healthy. Even stature of Europeans increased by like 4 inches on average over several generations, right? What did European society do with that prosperity between, say, 1150 and 1300?
They built amazing things.
They built amazing things, mind-blowing things. In fact, you could almost say, without exaggeration, that the whole of European society came together and created this magnificent enterprise of the cathedrals, the great cathedrals. And when you begin to study into those cathedrals, and you realize the amount of labor and effort and knowledge that went into them, and not just even a single cathedral like Amiens or Chartres would be extraordinary. But there's like 80 of them. And then there's like 500 lesser, but even in their own right are spectacular and magnificent. The stained glass windows that have refractory properties that we still haven't really figured out yet. The recipe for the mortar that bonds the stones together is harder than the stones themselves, creating an integral mass. The geometry that was utilized in the design and the construction of these cathedrals, some of which I'm going to be teaching in the Sacred Geometry retreat that's coming up at the end of the month. The engineering skill, the sculptural programs that are just breathtaking when you look at how well executed they are. The stone quarrying, the stone cutting, and the stone carving. You're talking about masters of these skills. Where did they come from? It's a mystery. Who organized them? Who organized these guilds of these builders? Just showed up, between roughly 1830 and 1850, in 20 years, boom. These gigantic things are coming up out of the ground. And you look at these soaring ogival vaults and towers, they're totally aerodynamic. Look sometime, in fact, I can show you a slide here where you look at the cross-section of the ogival vault of Chartres and superimpose that on the aerodynamic form of the space shuttle. Perfect fit, right? They were showing us the spires with the cross at the top. Well, the cross is the symbol of the material world, isn't it? It's the symbol of Earth, right? What happens when you put that cross on the top of the tall, tapered steeple, which coincidentally has very similar proportions to that of a rocket ship? Look at a Saturn rocket ship and then look at your typical church steeple. It's like a symbol. It's right there. And so here's the rocket ship lifting up the material world towards the heavens. That's what every church steeple with a cross on the top is signaling, that message to us. Somebody back then in the high Middle Ages, some force, something, was able to inspire a whole continent of people to pick up trowels and go to work on this great project. And only when the climate finally turned on them in the 1300s, when the Little Ice Age, when that warm period came to an end and the Ice Age came back, and the crops failed in the field, and people started going hungry again. And then after a generation of hunger and malnourishment, the Justinian plague wiped out half the population of Europe. At that point, the great enterprise was done. It wasn't 100% finished, but they got as much done as they could in that window of opportunity. Before that window closed. We have a window of opportunity. We're not going to be building cathedrals of stone, right, out on the plains of Europe. We're going to build cathedrals of precious cosmic metals that we can mine ourselves from the moon, from the asteroids, and we will build the holy city. We will build a cosmic civilization. And if we can succeed and do that, well, yeah, the angels will open the gateways for us and say, yep, you've proved your worth. You can now rejoin the celestials. But until you've proven the worth, we're going to stay out of your business. We're going to let you know we're here. Oh, yeah. We're going to let you know we're here. And we've been here all along. but it's part of our creed is we don't intervene. We don't intervene. We have a strict policy of non-intervention until we get signals from you that you're standing at the doorway and you're knocking at the door. And if we deem you worthy, we'll open that door. And that could happen. That could happen within a couple of years, within a few years. But also, what we need to do is we need to have vision and wisdom and knowledge in our leadership positions. I don't necessarily think we've got that to the level that I would like to have, but what I think has happened is we're now breaking up the whole Trump administration, and what he's doing is completely imploding and exploding the blob, the deep state blob that had become so entrenched and so bureaucratic. It was consuming $3 trillion of resources every year and returning what to the economy? Waste, sloth, lethargy, a whole subculture of privileged politicians and bureaucrats, people who are parasites on the bulk of society, but who constitute the core of the deep state blob. And of course, the left is so heavily invested in the deep state blob that they're all upset now that, thousands of administrators are being given their walking papers. But that's actually going to be a good thing for them because, look, now you have the opportunity to come back into the private sector and contribute something of real market value. And what do we want to do? Okay, I want a lean and mean government. That's what I want. That's what we're supposed to. That's our constitutional model is lean and mean, right? It just has a few functions what it does, but everything else, charitable, much better handled by the private sector. But what happens when you create a system that favors one form, which is a political form? Well, here we'll create a welfare system and we'll force you to give us money to pay for that welfare system. We'll create an educational system, but we'll have a monopoly. Oh, you want to have a private? Yeah, we'll let you have private schools, but you've got to obey our rules. Here's the curriculum you've got to teach. Here's the agenda, et cetera, et cetera. Or we're giving you tax privileges. Well, those tax privileges are going to be taken away from you if you don't obey our agenda. So if Trump is serious, and I hope to hell he is, that he wants to pull the plug on the Department of Education, that we got along just fine with up until the Jimmy Carter administration. And what's happened? They created the federal bureaucracy. It becomes top-heavy. You get thousands and thousands of administrators. The $100 billion that's now allocated towards education is mostly going to the top end. So you've got this whole class of bureaucrats and administrators running the thing. Well, we don't need that. The homeschool movement has proved you don't need any of that. And the kids are still getting better educated. Once that's done, you're out of it. The monopolistic stranglehold on American education could very well be coming to an end now. I'm 100% in favor of Donald Trump and the Trump administration pulling the plug on the educational bureaucracy, the Department of Education. And we'll quickly, within a year or two or three, we're easily going to adapt. You'll see if the mandates of government-run education were ended tomorrow, within a couple of years, the market would have stepped right into that void and provided alternatives, the worst of which would probably still be better than what we've already got with the government monopoly.
And there is a lot of alternative education already.
Yes, already.
Yeah, through digital and virtual interaction most of the time. And there's more and more like physical entities and locations that are popping up, but there's so many other options. And it's only going to get better.
So what I want, Donald, are you listening, Donald? Are you listening? JD, I know you know who I am because Joe Rogan gave me a great shout out when he was interviewing you. So before you forget, remember Joe Rogan said, I forget what he said about Randall Carlson, but whatever it was good. And he told that to J.D. Vance. This was before the election. So here's the message. You guys do need to sit down and talk to the Russians. You need to sit down and talk to the Chinese. You need to sit down and talk to the Iranians. We need to start dialogues. And somebody needs to say, look, we have this tremendous window of possibility in front of us. And there's no reason for us to waste our energy and our resources here fighting each other when by a little bit of cooperation, yes, we can certainly have friendly competition. That would be very good. There's nothing wrong with friendly competition, right? You want that. What I think of is you got two UFC fighters. They go out there and beat the shit out of each other for whatever 10 rounds, and then at the end they hug each other, right? So they're in effect they're allies. Well, we can have friendly competition. We had competition with the Soviet Union during the space race. Well, the Soviets realized they weren't going to win the race to the moon, so they focused on other things. And those other things were really valuable because they know a whole lot more about long-term human habitation in space than we do. They've got a lot more experience in that. They've got other things that they emphasized. What we've emphasized, what they've emphasized would be very complementary to each other. Look, like I said, the Chinese are going right on ahead. They're going to do it. They're not waiting for us. They're going to do it. And if we don't do something, we're going to fall behind. We were the leaders. We were the spear tip going into space that brought humans into space. It was our inventions. Think about this. You're down there, what are we, 1,000 miles apart?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're using satellites now to talk to each other and see each other. Those satellites didn't exist when I came into the world. We had no space presence in 1951 when I came into the world. So now look what we're doing, right? Well, if we have the vision and the will, we will be within a decade, certainly within a generation, we'll be a spacefaring civilization. And we can be developing the infinite energy and material resources that are just waiting for us out there. My God, the asteroid belt. Let's look at a few possibilities here. Oh, well, with the recent discovery and with the Artemis missions that are now underway, it's verifying the presence of billions of tons of water in the polar regions of the moon. Well, that was a big factor in how easily and economically feasible is colonization of the moon going to be. Well, if there's some water there, that'll sure make it easier because we know already that large areas of the regolith are 40% oxygen, and we know how to extract that oxygen and turn it into breathable air. We also know that there are, high refractory metals, all extraordinary concentrations of high refractory metals it's almost like somebody put it there, right? Here you use those same high refractory metals to build rocket ships and go to the moon, and then you discover, oh wow,
they're everywhere.
Look at yeah, right. Well, we just needed water. Well, it looks like there's water. Well, the other problem is shielding from cosmic radiation, right? Well, now NASA is admitting that, we know that there's large, gigantic cavities and caves in the moon. And that's what I've been saying for 25 years now, clandestinely. Yeah. But, I went on Matt Bell's last fall, and I decided that the time had come to start disclosing some of these ideas about the moon and its role in our past and in our future. And I went on, and we can look at the quote. He's quoted me. He's got in his, what it's called, the cold open. Is that what it's called? The
intro sequence?
Yeah, that entrance sequence for the episode I was on. He's quoting me talking about the existence of gigantic caves in the moon. And what I then subsequently talked about was with these gigantic caves will allow us places, to set up shop, basically, insulated from cosmic radiation, right? Then that episode aired, and in 4 or 5 days later, NASA comes out with an announcement that there's huge caves on the moon. Of course, just a coincidence. I'm not saying that, that somebody at NASA said, hey, some schmo over on this guy's podcast is talking about big caves on the moon. was not really a secret, but it was just one of those things that had been discovered and nobody paid any attention to it except
Right.
the small handful of guys that were involved in the discovery. But what that means is it suddenly changes the whole equation for colonizing the moon and building an international port city on the moon, which would be one of the first steps. Is that we see the moon is like one of the great port cities at the dawn of the age of exploration. Whether it was in Portugal or whether it was in Spain or whether it was up in northwestern Europe, you had these great cities that became port cities. London was a port city, right? And it was there that the explorers went out, right? Part of this whole age of exploration was ultimately the recovery. It took us 2 or 3 centuries to recover from the first onset of the Little Ice Age. We got really knocked back. When the plague wiped out, the bubonic plague wiped out half the population of Europe, that was a setback, a major setback. And then there were several more. Solar minimums in there. The climate would warm up for a while and you just, get your bearings and then boom, it would go cold again, right? You had like 3 or 4 solar minimums in that period. You also had spasms of volcanism. So the last great spasm of volcanism that happened between 1809 and 1815, it yielded, its end result was 1816, the year without a summer, which has been termed the last great subsistence crisis of Western civilization by historians. And we haven't had an equivalent spasm of volcanism like that since then. However, if we did again, there would be extreme consequences, particularly to the undeveloped countries. In America, we have, I think, last time I checked, it was six months food stockpiled. But what do you do if you have 2 years in a row of agricultural collapse? Well, then it comes down to what do you as an individual, what have you done?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. So, anyways, we're in this position. We don't know how long it's going to last. When is the next impact? When is the next spasm of volcanism going to cause us to go into a volcanic winter? When is the next solar outburst going to affect, some of the Carrington event that we know would have dramatic effects on our electronic grid was weak compared to some of the other solar events that we know have happened, right? That would be a good topic to talk about in another podcast. But some of the solar events that have happened within the last 2,000 years, if they were to repeat themselves, the whole grid would shut down for. There'd be no computers would be pretty much offline for however long it took. What do we do then? You go to the store, they have no means to take cash. Everything's computerized. What would that do to the economy? What would that do to our society? It would be totally, horribly disruptive, right? We're not ready for that. So let's figure out ways to harden our system against that, or at least have backups in place so that we can restore a semblance of power as quickly as possible. It's all a matter of coming back to our priorities as a society. And up to this point, our leadership has basically been engaged in a gigantic international criminal enterprise.
Pretty much.
And they have been displaced now. And of course, they're screaming bloody terror, because they don't want to see their little, what am I trying to say? Their little enclave of wealth and power and privilege disturbed or ended. And in fact, some of them may get exposed and called out for their criminal behavior. And they don't want that.
No, they don't. Well said. We got a bright future ahead, though.
But we
Times are
do.
changing.
Well, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that whether you like him or not, what he's done is by disrupting the status quo, he's creating tremendous opportunities. And if we can get that message up to him, up to this administration, which I think is entirely possible, that, look at what we could be doing if we just set aside our make-believe differences and started working together like societies across Europe did in the 1100s, we could surpass them with what we could create in the next century. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's go for the moon. Let's build an international outpost on the moon and use that as the launching pad for the exploration and colonization of the solar system. It's like Kraft Ehricke said, if God, he was a rocket scientist, right?
Mm-hmm.
What was he, German?
I believe he was, yes.
Yeah. He said if man had not intended, if God had not intended man, and I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but it's basically this: if God had not intended man to become to create a spacefaring civilization, he wouldn't have given him the moon.
Yeah.
So
Let's aim for the moon, literally.
Yeah, I would much rather be cooperating with the Russians to build a space an outpost on the moon than going to war with them. Going to war, everybody loses, even the people that perpetrate the war, because, of course, they're relying on the whole systems of continuity of government that they put in place. So they've got all their elaborately supplied underground bunkers for up to 2 years. Right. So, knowing they've got that, that's sort of like, oh, okay, that's their fallback position. If we're going to push and push and push up to the threshold, but if it crosses that threshold, well, we'll retreat to our bunkers and have to hide out there in luxury for 2 years. And then when we emerge, we're in charge. I mean, literally.
Literally, yes.
Literally, yeah. And I don't want that to happen, and it doesn't have to happen.
Doesn't need to.
But we were headed directly for that, because let's face it, who really did not know that Joe Biden was totally not in charge of anything? You walk around and, no, you got, come this way. No, that's the wrong way. You got to go up the stage this way. I mean, literally. He's as sharp as a tack. What? How can you how can you even present yourself to the public without shame and embarrassment for saying such stupid things?
It's so funny. My girlfriend is Belarusian, and we have a little vacuum, like a Roomba, a self-driving robot.
Uh-huh.
And I had just turned on the news once, and we're watching it. And she was like, who is that? I'm like, that's the president of the United States. And she was like, he's like the Roomba. And it's just like walking back and forth, walking into things. It never knows what it's doing. So funny. But no longer. No more. Well, okay, Randall. Any final closing quotes, remarks, thoughts?
Well, that we'll resume this. We'll have another conversation, and we'll continue these ideas. Because again, what I was saying is, I want to get these ideas out. I want people to talk about them. I want these ideas to filter up, which they can, because I think they're ideas whose time has come, and they're realistic. And we in the early 1960s, we had a leader of vision, John F. Kennedy. He paid with his life for his refusal to knuckle under to the, at that point, evolving deep state blob. But he gave us a vision, and maybe you might argue that if he hadn't been assassinated, it was partly his assassination that fueled the desire to fulfill his vision. We get to the moon. Mm-hmm. And so pretty much all of America got behind it and was excited about it. Once we did it, we beat the Russians, it was kind of like, okay, now we go back to more prosaic things than talking about colonizing the moon or exploring the moon. But yeah, NASA had a very ambitious program. Mars was scheduled to be, first Mars expedition was scheduled to occur before the 80s was over. But by that time, it was believed that there would be a permanent manned presence on the moon, and that we would be developing the moon for those purposes to use for a launch pad rather than the Earth. Because obviously with 1/5 the gravity, it's much more economical to launch from the moon than it is from the Earth. To bring in payloads. And so, what I hear now is, we shouldn't do anything to the moon. We go up there. It's like, look, haven't you learned? Okay, so we came to the North American continent, the Europeans did, and one of the things they learned was that the indigenous people that had been living with the environment for generations deliberately disturbed the environment. They set fires to the forest regularly. They did controlled burnings all over the continent, right? That was intervention, right? We come along, and since the early 1900s, came along with the Smokey Bear paradigm, which is that only you can prevent forest fires. And the attempt was snuff forest fires out as soon as they were discovered. And you did not allow, you didn't allow regular burning to occur. Then now you come on top of that and you have the environmental movement that basically shut down, like for example, the logging industry in the Pacific Northwest, even put these draconian restrictions on accessibility. So you had logging roads going into the forest. Now, yeah, I can argue that, and I totally agree with, clear cutting is not the way to go, other than very limited patches. Because when you do clear cut a limited patch, you create a whole mosaic, a very rich ecological mosaic, right? But you don't want to clear cut large swaths, right? There's,
Right.
it's right. You manage forestry. That's silviculture, and you got to do it intelligently. Well, so it became hands off. So you had logging roads where they would go in there and they would extract timber, and those logging roads were locked off, right? They were allowed to regrow, right? I remember going some of my first trips in the 90s out in the Pacific Northwest, going in some of those back roads with four wheels, coming back 5-6 years later, during the Clinton years, right? And now they're locked and gated. We couldn't drive in there anymore, right? Well, when the firefighters come to those roads, they can't traverse those roads anymore. They're overgrown. They were, forcibly shut down. And meanwhile, you had insect blights that occurred, killing tens of millions of trees. Those trees died. They've fallen over. They become part of the fuel load on the forest floors. I mean, talk about catastrophes waiting to happen. Those extreme catastrophic forest fires are going to continue.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, timber companies have been begging to get access, go in there and harvest the dead timber. Well, no, you can't do that because of you'll affect this particular type of snail that lives in this creek. Well, that may be true, but then when you get catastrophic forest fires that are burning at a couple of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit and cause those streams to boil away, what do you think happens to the snail darters? What do you think happens to, So again, this is a blowback. So non-interventionism doesn't work. We are part of nature, and we use our reason and learn how we can optimally and positively impact or interact with nature in a positive way. The Native Americans had that down pretty damn good, and they would regularly set fires to do, and then the Europeans came along and said, no, we're going to snuff fires out. And then, of course, the horrible fires in the Palisades right now that have happened those last few weeks, that's at that interface now between wild forests that have not been properly managed and residences, see? It's like a recipe for disaster right there, see? And that's what happened. You had the Santa Ana winds come in, and most of those fires were human-caused. A lot of them were probably arson. In fact, we know that they've captured at least, several of people that were caught deliberately starting fires. Now, I want to know more about that. Is it just vandals? Is it some 14-year-old kid, hey, I'm going to start a fire? Or is there an agenda there? Is somebody starting fires? I don't know. I haven't looked into it. I don't know. But here's the point. When the people say, oh, no, we can't touch the moon, hands off. Well, I would say, look, for a couple of billion years, the moon has just been pulverized. It's a repository of building materials. That's what it is. The whole regolith that covers the surface of the moon, we could mine and mine and mine billions and billions of tons. It would not affect the moon in the least. Not in the least. But the moon is a stepping stone. We're not going to go up there and mine the moon out of existence. But we could mine dangerous Earth-crossing asteroids out of existence. We could be doing that within a generation and reaping the harvest of their incredible riches. So I think we should pick up this discussion we're having and talk about the specifics of moving into space and how we would do that, and look in more detail, and really work on laying out a game plan, and perhaps even trying to reach out and connect with other people who are sharing this kind of a vision, and they're out there.
Yeah.
And we need to pool our resources, get together, and become a force to be reckoned with.
Yes. And we'll do it sooner rather than later.
Hallelujah, bro.
All right. Always a pleasure, Randall.
You got it, Becket.